ever think about how rhythm games are relatively new? Obviously, compared to genres like Battle Royales or Auto Chess, 1996 is pretty old, but in the grand scale of games, it's still weird to think about. Like, RPGs have been around since pen and paper, and were able to be brought into the digital world relatively simply. Games based around music, though, had to wait for the technology to catch up to it in order to actually have music worth listening to. There were a few attempts at rhythm games on fully synthesized consoles, but they had their charms. But it took the cutting-edge technology of the PS1's CD drives for rhythm games to really pick up, thanks to the full audio playback. And rhythm games are notoriously good at that, actually. They're always at the boundary of what weird technology they can get away with using. There's a reason why the arcade scene is still dominated by rhythm games, and it's because there's so many experiences that are borderline impossible to fully replicate from home. Things like a full-scale speaker system, the custom flashing RGB lighting, or the thousands of unique controllers that the genre has become famous for. Which brings up an interesting point. For other genres, like the aforementioned RPG, difficulty is pretty similar and linear. It's a given that as compared to the start, enemies will have more health, deal more damage, and have harder to counter moves as the game goes on. Rhythm games, though? There's so many literal moving parts within each experience that labeled difficulty starts to become arbitrary once you leave a specific title. And for the $500,000 question, which of these songs is harder? Is it A, Through the Fire and Flames on Expert? B, Through the Fire and Flames on Expert? C, Through the Fire and Flames on Expert? Or D, you get the bit by now, right? From an outside perspective, these are identical. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that. But this one's the chart from Guitar Hero 3, this one's the chart from Guitar Hero Live, this one's the chart from Beat Saber, and this one's the Clone Hero chart of it, played on a laptop keyboard in an airplane. Now obviously interpretation brings differences, and games that tackle similar topics often overlap broadly in what they cover and what they actually do, but that doesn't answer the question. Look, I get it, 500k is a lot to put on the line. You could get a lot of Genshin rolls with that kind of cash. So let me use a lifeline for you and dive into the real question. What makes each of these games hard, and how do you quantify that? I had to think about this a lot recently, because I just spent the last month working with a great team to make a rhythm visual novel from the ground up for the Deepwell Game Jam. It's a cute little thing, and I'm proud of the work we did on it. We're hoping to do more soon, but the link is in the description if you'd like to check out the proof of concept. In doing that, though, I identified a few different aspects of difficulty, which I've represented with this graphic of an audio fader. The louder a fader gets, the harder that specific aspect becomes. So, what do each of these mean? Well, before I go more in depth with each of these, I'm gonna go ahead and write myself an out. I didn't make the games I'm going to compare against, nor am I a master at any of them. I'm gonna miss some subtlety, that's a given. Likewise, I'm not saying that this is the only thing that makes each game difficult, but rather, it's something I noticed from the outside looking in. Are we cool? The first of these all is quantity, which is probably the easiest to notice. How many inputs do you have to make a second? It's also the most commonly used of the difficulties whenever easy mode steps up. More things to hit means more things to miss. Dance Dance Revolution is a perfect example of this, where the only difference between the basic version of a song and the difficult version is just that, more notes. No new mechanics are added, the speed of the notes stay the same, it's just the amount being fed to you. Which brings up speed. Speed isn't necessarily the tempo of a song, rather, it's the amount of time between when you first see the input you need to make and when you need to make it. How fast you need to react. Friday Night Funkin' is a great example of this. Building off of DDR, on top of the quantity of the notes played, the difference between easy and hard comes down to how much time you have to process what you actually need to do. Notes linger for way longer on easy and zoom to you on hard. But for both of these, there's the same amount of buttons. And button seems like an obvious one, but I more mean it in the fighting game sense of the word. How many different types of inputs do you need to make? And a great way to show that off is Groove Coaster. Depending on the difficulty you select, they increase not only the quantity, but the variety of what you have to do. Before each song starts, it shows you a list of all of the different types of notes featured and how you hit them. This changes from level to level, and harder difficulties for the same song have a higher selection of buttons it needs you to hit. You're still using the same controller, they're just asking you to do more complicated things with it. That's not to say that using different controllers wouldn't change the difficulty. Hell, if anything, controller difficulty is one of the most iconic. Games like Taiko no Tatsujin use the same set of 6 inputs in all of their songs, which are just evolutions of the main two, Don and Ka. But they ask you to make those inputs into an actual drum. The controller, among other things, is what makes Taiko so difficult. Actively alternating between the middle and the rim of the drum, having to get quick inputs off with literal fulcrum rolling. You're not playing a game by that point, you're drumming, full stop. You switch the Taiko out for a snare and you're ready for halftime. Clearing the level with a regular controller is still possible, of course, but they don't make the arcade cabinets with built-in USB slots, you know? Be cool if they did, though. Especially since even with an easier way to make inputs, the patterns in the song would still be really difficult, or what notes you have to hit and when. It's kind of an obvious one when you think about it, but where the notes are actually positioned is a big indicator of difficulty. Like if we looked purely at the quantity of the songs in Jam or Lammy, Stage 3's Rockabilly Baby Baby is ridiculous compared to the other songs. But all of the notes you need to play are the same and in a real easy rhythm, one after another. The pattern is super simple. Unlike some of the later levels, like Stage 5's Power On, Power Off. There's less notes being played, but you're using the whole controller each stanza and at weird half beats, jumping in and out of call and response. The pattern is way more complex, which is difficult. The good news about Lammy, though, is that since it encourages freestyling, even if you input twice or miss the timing, the game is very forgiving. Forgiveness is an interesting one, since it comes in a bunch of different shades. How late or early you're allowed to hit a note, how many inputs you're allowed to miss before you game over, or even if there's a game over state at all. While it's typically reserved for arcades to try and squeeze some more quarters out of you, some games double down on being particularly unforgiving, like Super Hexagon, which compensates its simple gameplay by only needing one slip-up before you lose. This makes actually surviving feel great, though, and with little to no time between each attempt, it's addictive in a really great way! The game is brutal, and it's compounded even more by its insane visuals. If the screen were stationary and the lights weren't pounding, it wouldn't make reading where to go next as much of a complication. Visuals, or messing with readability, is a fun one, and my personal favorite of the 9. A stellar example of this is Rhythm Doctor, which compensates for having only one button and telegraphed patterns by doing everything in its power to stop you from having a clear visual on the note you need to hit. It does so by blocking the note's path, completely turning off the audio, faking lag and other technical issues, moving the path around the screen, even moving the screen itself. Because everything else is so simple, they can crank what your eyes and ears have to follow all the way up, without worrying about the chart itself becoming illegible. Heck, it's simple enough that some levels have you managing multiple charts at the same time. Management is definitely one of the weirder ones just because it's very broad, but it boils down to how many plates you have to keep spinning at once. In traditional rhythm games, this is typically reserved for boss-style encounters or attacks and versus modes. But games like Crypt of the Necrodancer make this their bread and butter. Alongside the constant throbbing beat, you have to manage your positioning, your inventory, your health, your weapon's reach, any secondary effects you might have, and obviously all of the enemies. It's a lot to keep in mind, on top of keeping up a steady rhythm. But for some games, like Rhythm Heaven's Mr. Upbeat, keeping a steady rhythm is all you need. The challenge comes from the duration, or how long you can keep it up. Duration's how long anything is from the start to finish before reaching the win state, or in the case of endless games, the end state. There's actually an entire subculture of rhythm gamers dedicated to stamina play, or going non-stop for absurd amounts of time, and more power to them, honestly. Being able to identify what difficulty appeals most to you, and then having a community's worth of people to help you set that is astounding, and a perfect example of why visualizing difficulty like this is really helpful. A game that really does that well is Beat Saber. Sure, it still has the old one-word difficulty tags, but you get to directly see what going from easy to expert means before the level even starts. On top of that, it has a wall of modifiers, allowing you to change the way it's played. Each track allows you to go as easy as you'd like, or crank up as many optional difficulties as possible. So does that make C the final answer? If it has all these optional difficulties to add, then it's gotta be the hardest thing there, outside of, maybe, Turbulence. To which I say, it's subjective. I realize that quantifying difficulty on a scale with a set end would make it seem like there's a maximum difficulty that you could achieve, but that's way off base. Simply put, there'll always be a way to change the difficulty to be even higher. Sure, the Beat Saber chart's hard already, but could you do it blindfolded? Everything you're comparing with these 9 has to be relative to something else. There is no standard baseline game until you personally establish one. then everything is either higher or lower than that. And even then, we can objectively say that the quantity of A is higher than C, but unless quantity is what you find most difficult, that doesn't matter. What matters is which of these you personally struggle most with, and more important than that, if you think that struggle translates well to fun. Because like I said, there'll always be a way to crank all of these to heights you hadn't even considered. But would you enjoy playing that? Figuring out your metaphorical Goldilocks is key. Where you find the most fun for your time with something that's challenging but not impossible. And as you play more, that'll probably change, and what you found hard at one point will start to feel like the standard. And while one game's expert might still be harder than another's, you can tell why. My name is Potential. Thank you for your time. Have a good rest of your day, alright?